but we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Samueli. It is now 9:10 p.m. in a, as you would have expected, very grim, very depressing, dismal Budapest, where the days are going very, very short. Lights switched on, middle of the day. Um, Everything prepared for a long, intolerable, dreary fall and winter. It's now, like inevitable now, and it's I can't even begin to tell you how depressing it is. However, so as not to get everybody too down so early on. Um, um, Thank you very much, everybody who has joined me. I really appreciate it. I got I noticed some people already bringing up, the topic that is a favorite of mine, which is a gray night, gray, depressing, dreary, gray on gray of fall and winter. And so Ahmadovich says that on this gray night, the cold is beginning to fill the atmosphere. Let's enjoy the long night together on the stream, even if it comes with the usual sad news. Okay, that's very nice. Thank you. That's really, I appreciate that. That's good. And then Peter Kovic says, George, do you find it weird that people use Alexander Solzhenitsyn's work as a scholarly source for understanding the Soviet Union? I don't know. I don't know whether people use him exactly as a scholarly source. I mean, he's. I mean, I think people look upon his work as a kind of a work of literature, history. I mean, I'm sure plenty of writers have done that. They've intermingled fiction with history writing, but they're not really sources of history. I mean, Tolstoy did that obviously in War and Peace, where he would feature Napoleon, and and Solzhenitsyn was very much in that tradition. So I don't know whether people um, treat him as a scholarly source. Now, the more problematic aspect, of course, is where particularly his American admirers turned against him. Was obviously on the question of the Jews, and that's of course a very interesting subject in itself. His own view of the relationship between Russians and Jews, and he debunked a number of the myths about particularly the anti-Semitism in Russia, about the pogroms. I mean, he didn't deny them, but he thought that they'd been somewhat overstated. Um, and of course, he did point to the extensive presence of Jews among the Bolsheviks, um, but, um, but at the same time, he kind of he hedged his bets a little bit. I mean, his major book, and I think we had that on the Gaggle book club about 200 years together, the Russians and the Jews, and so it's nowhere near as contentious as you might think. Um, but it's important that he debunked a lot of the myths. I think he debunked the myths of systematic Russian anti-Semitism. He didn't think that the Tsar Alexander III actually really launched this pogrom against the Jews, and he obviously knocked out of the park the nonsense that the Soviet Union was anti-Semitic. I mean, that was a ridiculous nonsense that was invented by the West. Um, I see Stone River. There's a very interesting question. It says, "What do you think of Stephen Kotkin's two-volume Stalin?" Yeah, there's a third volume that's supposedly supposed to arrive. It's a useful book. I don't particularly like it. I think much of it, I think, is a little tendentious. Um, I didn't feel that I learned very much from it. If you don't know a great deal about the subject, then it's a good read. You'll learn something. I didn't think I'd learned that much, and I thought his judgments were just not very interesting. I mean, they were very standard issue, what you might have expected. Somebody who was obviously very critical of Stalin and the Soviet Union. I think a much more interesting um, perspective on Stalin you would get from, say, Sheila Fitzpatrick, whom we had on the Gaggle a few weeks ago, and she's written some books on Stalin. I think she is much more balanced and much more um, insightful into, I mean, obviously into some of Stalin's positive contributions, and obviously on some of Stalin's negative contributions. And of course, she highlighted that during her appearance with us. But So I think her book, I think it's called "On Stalin's Team." I have that book. I think it's well worth reading. It's about the as you might gather from the title, the people who were around Stalin. How he kind of built his team, which more or less remained intact. I mean, give or take the few people who just died along the way of natural causes, but more or less from the late 1920s through to the early 1950s. She charts that, and she charts really, the aspects of Stalin that are often neglected. I mean, such as his embrace of Russian culture, his embrace of Russian nationalism, and his opening of the Russian churches, which is a real contribution. Because he did turn against much of the sort of the Bolshevik nihilistic uh, revolutionism, and he kind of moved it the country into in a more conservative direction in all sorts of ways, not just on family policy, but education, the writing of history, culture, and then, as I say, religion. He opened the churches during the war and kept them open. The persecution of the Russian Orthodox Church resumed only after his death. But anyway, there's a couple of things I want to talk about, and then we can discuss some Q&A. First of all, last week the Guardian had this article, and I posted it on our locals page, complaining that the great Russian soprano Anna Netrebko was hired by the Royal Opera House, and uh, and so I think it was La Boheme. So it's not anything like that interests me that much, but she was, I think, performing in La Boheme, and so the Guardian wrote this article by one of its writers, lamenting the hiring of Netrebko. Now, Netrebko is obviously one of the great soprano singers of the world. Ooh, Marty, as always, post his his absolutely hilarious memes, and this meme is of that the ghastly current Chancellor of Germany, Friedrich Schmerz. His name is Friedrich Merz, but they call him Schmerz. Kopfschmerz. Like a headache. Anyway, so now you think, well, why would people be against Netrebko being singing in the Royal Opera House? Because obviously the audiences in London and elsewhere want to listen to um, Netrebko. But apparently, the Guardian's objections were not that she supports Putin, or not that she supports the war in Ukraine, not that she's in favor of Russia waging war against anybody. She never said that. No, the problem with her is that she hasn't condemned Putin and Russia and the war in Ukraine sufficiently. Apparently, you have to condemn and condemn and condemn and condemn, day and night before you get to be invited to perform at the Royal Opera House in London. Of course, this is a ludicrous argument because nobody has ever demanded that of American performers or American athletes, that before they're allowed to take part in any cultural event or take part in any sporting event, they must, of course, distance themselves from anything unpleasant that the United States government is doing. So it's not like say, well, I'm afraid, particularly during the years of the Iraq War, nobody said, well, you can't have American opera stars performing unless they first denounce George W. Bush, unless they first denounce the Iraq War. And of course, they didn't say that about American athletes. But they do say this about Russia. And so somehow Russians are expected to be denouncing their governments and, and denouncing war in Ukraine, and all the time. Once isn't going to do it because Netrebko, had criticized what Russia was doing in Ukraine. She had done that, but apparently that's not enough. You're just doing it once. That ain't going to do it. You got to do it all the time. So that was the Guardian's problem. So as to say, and of course Israel. I mean, we don't even need to get into that. As to what Israel does, and yet it's never a condition of Israeli athletes that hey, well, we're not going to have Israeli athletes competing unless they duly denounce the actions of the Israeli government. Or any Israeli cultural stars, where we can't have them until they denounce the actions of the Israeli government. No one ever thinks that. And as I say about the Americans, you can't say, well, we're not going to have any Americans performing until they denounce the America enabling what Israel is doing in Gaza. So it's always for only the Russians who are expected to denounce their government as a condition to be accepted in the club of the civilized people. Now, the problem, of course, there is that if it is the case that the Russian government is so horrific and such a terrible, monstrous entity, then you'd say, well, that's surely not a great idea to expect Netrebko or Valery Gergiev or any Russian cultural star to start denouncing the Russian government because this terrible, horrible Russian government might retaliate against the star's family. I mean, you would expect, according to the terms of the logic, that's how the Russian government would respond. I mean, if the Russian government is totalitarian, authoritarian, or whatever, then surely it's not going to tolerate its stars or its sportsmen denouncing it. So it was always ridiculous to make those demands. But it was just a special case for Russia. It's only Russians who are expected to denounce their government. But anyway, so that was the Guardian last week, and saying no, it was terrible for the Royal Opera House to have Netrebko perform. But this week, the Guardian writes this very long article celebrating Ukrainians um, burning and otherwise getting rid of their Russian language books. So imagine Russian language books and Russian classics, Russian literature that they're it's celebrating that these Russians, I mean these Ukrainians, are picking up these books and burning them or just dumping them somewhere and letting them rot. And the Guardian thinks this is fantastic, great. That's exactly what one should do. Now remember, nobody had ever done that, even during World War II. It wasn't thought appropriate to say, well, we really don't like the Germans very much. Why don't we pick up our volumes of Kant, Goethe, Hegel, and just burn them? And while we're at it, why don't we just go to the library and find any manuscripts of Beethoven or whatever, and dump them somewhere, so that let the insects just gnaw it away and so on. But so even then, so even during World War II, nobody thought that somehow. That Hitler Germany was equivalent to the great German cultural figures of the past. But here is this Guardian article. Let's just take a look. Just get a flavor of what's in it. And here we have, this is the headline: "Tainted Love: How Ukrainians are ridding themselves of Russian language books." Now, remember how many times over the years we've been told, about the scenes, the famous scenes. We've always seen those documentaries about the Nazis, about how they were burning books, even though that only happened, I think, once or twice, and it involved really that. We talked about this before. I think it was called this Institute of Sexual Research, and this mob just burst into this institute and took all the books and everything from this Institute of Sexual Research and just dumped it on the fire. And I think it was always um, likely that they just regarded that as decadent. It was though whatever was in that Institute of Sexual Research, they thought this was it exemplified the depravity of Weimar. So they didn't actually go in to the public library of Munich and take out their volumes of Kant and Schiller and just to say, what, we just don't like Kant and Schiller. We've had it, and we're going to dump it on the fire. So it was just that was that Institute for what I think was called Sexual Research. That and they regarded that as decadent. I mean, obviously, I don't condone the burning of books anywhere, but nonetheless, it's always been a little bit miscast as to what actual books were being burned, because whatever else you can say about the Germans, they do tend to respect books and learning. I mean, I think it doesn't come naturally to them to just pick up a pile of books and dump it on the fire. But anyway, here is the Guardian ridding themselves of Russian language books. And it says Putin's invasion has seen Ukrainian book lovers recoil from Russian literary dominance by a range of means. And so he has one day this summer, the Ukrainian artist Stanislav Turina took two of his books to his garden near Kiev. One was a volume of poems by Alexander Pushkin. The 19th century Russian has acquired a troubling resonance. So remember, this is a great Russian poet. A 19th century Russian has acquired a troubling resonance in Ukraine. Since the 2022 full-scale invasion of the country, he is frequently used by the invaders as a symbol of Russianness. Huge posters depicting the writer were, for example, erected in the southern city of Kherson during its occupation. Now, All of this is, of course, made up. A lot of it is just projection. And we know that this started almost immediately when Ukrainians started attacking Pushkin and all Russian literary giants as having been imposed on them, that they're being imposed, that their own precious, glorious Ukrainian culture was being crushed by this Russian barbarism of Pushkin. So this not the story that somehow that Pushkin is just being pushed, rammed down their throats, is just is projection. For many in Ukraine, it shows Putin is being co-opted as a cultural weapon in Russia's war. Some would also argue that Pushkin's poetry reinforced and even helped form Russia's imperial ideology. So this is all right. So now, that's what they've done here. So it starts off with, well, we don't really like Russian language books. Now suddenly, well, we don't like these Russian writers because they're reinforcing Russia's imperial ideology without really defining, specifying what is Russia's imperial ideology. Numerous statues of the writer have been dismantled since 2022, while many streets named after him, there were at least 594 in 2018, have reverted to their former names or been given new ones. Naturally, the Guardian doesn't go into, well, how many statues have been put up to Stepan Bandera since 2004, since the Orange Revolution? How many street names have been changed to Bandera and Shushkevich since 2004? So they say, oh, great, they've been taking down these statues. But notice what they've done. Again, Pushkin is a poet. I mean, he was a writer, a literary giant. So we're now not even talking about, oh, we have to take down these statues commemorating the Red Army's liberation. That was justified. Oh well, that reminds people of the terrible days of the Soviet dominance. That used to be the case. Oh, yeah, it's the terrible days of the Soviet dominance, even though the statues there were commemorating a historic reality, which was that these countries were liberated by the Red Army. So that was that. But now they're doing something very different. They say, well, we have to get rid of literary figures because they are reinforcing something called imperial ideology, but which we don't even know what that is, because of course you can say that in any country, a 19th century figure, and you say, well, he's reinforcing imperial ideology. And then what, you're supposed to take down statues of almost any 19th century literary figure, or even 20th century literary figure. Anyway, he goes on, Turina knew he could not sell the book. You couldn't give it to a friend, he says. You couldn't give it to a library. Imagine, he couldn't give it to a library. He can't give a book, a Pushkin, to a library. So a library would not take Pushkin. So in his garden, Turina gently, experimentally placed his volume of Pushkin on the bonfire. Notice the way these adverbs, gently, experimentally. It sounds kind of very, very, very nice sort of thing. Like you gently stroke the cat. You experimentally, plant something in your garden. Oh, I wonder whether this plant will grow. So they put but what is really, they're using these adverbs gently, experimentally, to mitigate the effect of what he is describing. You put a book on the bonfire, something that most would regard, well, that's pretty barbaric. I mean, putting any books on a bonfire is barbaric. it was barbaric when these, as I say, those people, the Nazis in 1933, all the Nazi supporters did it, even though, as I say, was they, it was always been miscast, misinterpreted what actually happened there. But leave aside that, he's putting Pushkin on the bonfire. Imagine said, well, you know what? I don't really like the French. I don't like Macron. I don't like Macron's policy wherever, I don't know, in a way, in Africa. And I'm going to put my volume of Balzac and Flaubert on the bonfire because I don't like Macron. And people say, well, you're a complete barbarian and an idiot into the bargain, because what the hell is Balzac and Flaubert got to do with Macron? Um, And then he says, feeding Pushkin to the flames was not some grandiose gesture of hate. No, of course not. I mean, you put a book on the bonfire. That's not a grandiose gesture of hate. No, 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 no hate there. Pure love. That's just that's it's there's no hatred there. No bad feelings there. It was an artist's private and exploratory act, he said. It's very private and very exploratory. And so he says, well, I'm afraid to burn books to destroy them, but nonetheless he did it. For me, it's symbolic of being barbarian. Yeah, but you did it. He said his purpose was quite different. He wanted to find out how he would feel. Would there be any catharsis? Grief? Anger? I didn't feel anything, he said. I felt nothing good, nothing bad. Well, but the important thing is here, he didn't feel anything bad. I mean, he put a book on the fire, something that most, civilizations regard as barbaric. And he put a book on the fire, a painting on the fire, whatever. And then he goes on. The second book in Turina's hand, so we're going back to the second book. The second book in Turina's hand was a volume of poetry by the contemporary writer Dmitry Vodenikov. I have to say, I haven't heard of him. For him, this represented a very different literary relationship. While a student in the western city of Lvov in the early 2000s, Turina saw Vodenikov perform his work. It was a revelation. And then he says, it was something new, a new voice. I understood he was gay. Oh, thank God. Well, that makes it, what a great guy. He wasn't just a Russian. He was a gay Russian. That's fantastic. I'm so happy. Now, that's a Russian you can respect. He was a gay Russian. It was between the lines. It was so tender. It was very cool, he said. I started to be his fan. But then, after 2022, Turina decided to check out Vodenikov's position on the war. And now, he said, I find he's a pro-war poet. Oh. Turina decided to leave his former hero's book in his garden to decay. So it's just to decay. So he didn't quite put it on the bonfire. That honor was reserved for Pushkin, but he left it in his garden to decay, which will be pretty quick. I mean, you get, with some rain and then with the insects and so on, I would imagine that'll be pretty speedy. And then it goes on. Across Ukraine, readers are facing decisions about what to do with their Russian language books. Many people, and especially those in the creative and cultural community, have switched to using Ukrainian in their everyday lives. Now, notice what they say. They've switched to using Ukrainian in their everyday lives. So that's evident that's something, up until 2 years ago, we're led to believe. Up until then, they were just speaking Russian. So much for this whole, this Ukrainian nation, this distinct Ukrainian entity separate from Russia. They were speaking Russian. How best to decolonize from centuries of Russian and Soviet cultural influence is a frequent point of discussion. So again, when they say these things, decolonize, what exactly does that mean? I mean, it's like if you're I mean, if you're I don't know, in some Anglo-Saxon country, do you have to decolonize from the influence of I don't know, Dickens and Thackeray, Jane Austen, E.M. Forster, all the way Kingsley Amis, just Julian Barnes, all of English literature. You have to decolonize. I don't want to read any of this stinking English literature. I want to read, the bona fide New Zealand literature. Um, and in that sense, Alexander Michket faced a similar situation when his house in Hostomel near Kiev was hit in the first weeks of the full-scale invasion. In his book, The Language of War, the writer, now a member of the armed forces, recounts visiting the ruins and finding his Dostoevskys and Nabokovs among the wreckage. The experience of losing his home has transformed his relationship to his possessions, including his books. Once you have become a refugee, you are always thinking like a refugee, he said. Better not to feel sentimental about the books. There are just kilos that you might have to think of what to do with if you need to leave. There are no Russian language books, even translations of foreign literature, in his new library. Congratulations. No more Dostoevsky, no more Nabokov, no more Tolstoy, no more Bulgakov, no more Chekhov. Boom, fantastic. Maybe, I guess only a Russian language book. So I think, maybe a Ukrainian translation of Nabokov, that might do it. But no Russian language Nabokov or Russian language Dostoevsky for him. And then he goes, this June, Mariana Matveychuk, a freelance journalism, took 90 kilos of Russian books. So that's a heavy one. Okay. To a recycling center near her home in Western Ukraine. So that's great. So that's what you need. Your recycling center, turn it into something useful. She said she had a book fetish and would frequent Kiev's sprawling secondhand book market in Pochina. When she graduated, she hauled her stash of books back to Western Ukraine by train. These are the volumes she has now recycled. So she went off, boom, recycle them, get something useful out of them. Clean environment. Sparing Anton Chekhov's letters and diaries. So why did she spare Chekhov's? But only his letters and diaries, not his plays or his short stories, just his letters and diaries. I have personal respect for him. Chekhov is funny. I like his sense of humor. Oh, well, that's it. You can spare Chekhov. Thank God he wasn't recycled because he had a nice sense of humor. And they're also hidden at my mom's, so no one will see Russian books on my shelves. Well, that's good. So imagine somebody might see Russian books on her shelf, and I don't know what would happen to her. She might just be punched in the face or whatever, thrown out of the window. I don't know. She considered trying to sell her books back to dealers at the Pochina book market, but I thought, no, I don't want to give them a second life. She doesn't want to give them a second life. We're talking about an extraordinary kind of hatred here. She's saying that she's giving them a second life by donating them to a secondhand bookstore, and somebody might buy them. No, that's a thing. We don't want to give them a second life. But of course, if they had their way, presumably they would just remove all Russian books from everywhere. I remember there was an article in the Times Literary Supplement sometime around 2022, just soon after the start of the war, along the lines of, well, I think all libraries should start getting rid of their Russian books because all of these Russian writers were guilty of something horrible. So everything that's going on in Ukraine is the direct fault of these Russian writers. So this went beyond the usual kind of, you've got to denounce Putin or whatever. This is that they just, all of the Russian literature, all of it, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, everything, led up to this war. Um, and so this so and that was in the Times Literary Supplement. I need to find this sometime and post it on on the locals board. Um, so, but she really, I don't want to give him a second life. So presumably she wants to find out how I got to stop them having a first life. How do we stop them having a first life? Well, you have to, I guess, remove them from the libraries. And but I think as you read this Guardian article, it's suggesting that that is exactly what they're doing. They're removing them from the libraries. Um, and here we go back to this. And so it says, the second life. And then she said, looking back at the number of academics texts she had read in Russian as a student, despite being a Ukrainian speaker at a Ukrainian language university. Oh, so apparently, here's the Guardian, um, saying, "Well, this is something outrageous." She's a Ukrainian speaker, even though a couple of paragraphs earlier we'd been told they were all speaking Russian. They only suddenly switched to Ukrainian a couple of years ago. But there's a suggestion, well, they're all Ukrainians, they're all Ukrainian speakers, this was, but they were forced to read in Russian. Wow, imagine that you're reading Russian literature in Russian. I can't, now I regard that as real punishment. Imagine you're being forced. When somebody says, well, I will not read Proust in French. That is just absolute outrage. I will only read Proust in English. I'm an English speaker. I will not be forced to read Proust and Flaubert in French. But despite being a Ukrainian speaker at a Ukrainian language university. She had reflected, she said, on the subtle Russification of the culture that had surrounded her. Oh, well, at least it was subtle. I mean, I thought a moment ago it was a sort of imperial dominance. So it was a subtle Russification. They all spoke Russian. All Ukrainians speak Russian. Everybody spoke Russian everywhere. Clearing out her Russian books, I got rid of Tolstoy, of Dostoevsky, of 12 tomes by poet and playwright Mayakovsky. And was also, she said, a way of saying goodbye to some of my perceptions when I was 20. I am saying goodbye to what I thought was important. So I got rid of my Tolstoy, I got rid of my Dostoevsky, and my 12 tomes of Mayakovsky. And you think to yourself, well, hey, this is pretty valuable. I mean, imagine, you get all these people, they throw up, they got 12 tomes of this, 20 tomes of Dostoevsky, and nice, you can pick them up for a song. But no, because nobody wants them. The only thing you can do with them is dump them on the fire, because these secondhand bookstores, you think they would snap them up? No, we don't want them. No, because no one's going to buy them. I mean, this is complete cultural barbarity, total Philistinism being celebrated in The Guardian. And in Pochina, the enormous secondhand book market in Kiev, business is not very brisk. It is certainly the place to go if you want to buy books in Russian. Although maybe not if you want to sell them, because they won't take them. In one corner, there is what one secondhand bookseller, Dmitro Drobin, called an Egyptian pyramid of books that no one can sell. Mainly Russian language, Soviet editions of everything from Tolstoy and Chekhov to popular fiction and Stendhal translations. So no one wants them. Those Soviet editions, I mean, they were kind of poor quality. I have Soviet editions here, collected works of Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, Chekhov, Turgenev. They're Soviet editions, and they're all the collected works. I mean, I didn't get them. I inherited that from my parents. I got them here in my apartment. And though the quality is low, I mean, what's remarkable is that they were relatively inexpensive. I mean, it was, the fact is that all these people have these collected works of Dostoevsky. It's a reflection of how cheap this was. You can almost, anybody could pick up the collected works of Tolstoy and have it on your bookshelf. I mean, imagine doing it now. You try and get a collected works of Tolstoy. I mean, it would just beyond anything. No one would be able to afford it. Another bookseller, who preferred not to give her name, sells secondhand and antiquarian books in Ukrainian and Russian. She said the choice of language was largely determined by generation. Young people mostly want to read in Ukrainian. She said when people offer her Russian books to buy, she rarely takes them. Demand is down. Well, demand is down because if you were to go into one of these stores and buy some Chekhov in Russian, probably somebody's going to accost you in the street and beat you to a bloody pulp. So that's not a good idea. I mean, so why would anyone want to get beaten up for buying Russian books? Occasionally, she said, customers ask for new books published in Russia. There are very, very few of these people. Yeah, I can imagine. From 2016, importing books from Russia has been restricted, requiring a permit, and since 2023, it has been outlawed. No, but that's very interesting. Remember, from 2016, so this is 2016, this is 6 years before the start of the war, importing books from Russia has been restricted. You're requiring a permit. So that was a big, it was a difficult to do, just to import books from Russia. And Dmitro Drobin, a bookseller surrounded in his shop by thousands of Russian language books, said he believed his government is pursuing forced Ukrainianization. He compared the climate to the situation under the Tsarist Empire, when publishing books in Ukrainian was severely restricted. So he's got the one voice, kind of a voice in the wilderness. And then Russian language books used by Ukrainian authors may be published, but since 2023 are ineligible for state grants. So that's a Ukrainian author who might write in Russian. That might happen, but you see, you can only, but he has to be a Ukrainian, but you're not going to get a state grant. Since 2023, books by Russian citizens may not be published. Ukrainian is the sole official language of the country, but Russian remains widely spoken. Minority languages include Crimean Tatar. So you get the sense here of this ridiculous a policy, really barbaric. But the Guardian is quite happy with this. And imagine if let's say this was going back in time, and we would be going to we'd be going to the wars in the Balkans. Well, not even, we don't even have to go back in time. We don't even have to go back to the 1990s. Let's say that the Republika Srpska said, you know what, we're not actually going to we're going to allow the sale of books by Croatian authors. I mean, can you imagine? The Guardian would just go absolutely crazy. I mean, this would be front page news. I mean, this is exactly what we thought about these horrible Serbs. They will ban. Imagine what they will do. They're ready to ban Croatian authors. It's also important that there's no symmetry here. The Russians aren't saying, well, we're not publishing any Ukrainian authors. I don't know, how much interest there is in Ukrainian authors in Russia, but maybe there is some. But what is interesting here is that that all of this which is directed at Russia, is celebrated. But if it had been done by anybody else was somehow burning books, banning books. Yeah, I don't think so. But that's the face of contemporary liberalism, as the Guardian. So the Guardian last week, this is outrageous. You can't have Anna Netrebko, the world famous soprano, performing at the Royal Opera House. You can't have that. Why can't you have that? Oh, because she's not condemning Putin, but she has condemned Putin. Yeah, but she hasn't done it recently. She only did it once. Oh well, then can't have her performing in La Boheme then. And now here, just a few days later, the Guardian saying, this is fantastic. This is great. Ukraine is just banning Russian books. Um, now, I want to talk about something that I know some people may find annoying, and is this announcement today by the International Association of Genocide Scholars, saying, "Oh, well, we experts on genocide, we know genocide when we see it. We say that what's going on in Gaza is genocide." And of course, this got a lot of publicity. And as I've said here before, I don't think one can characterize it as yet. I mean, that might change, but as yet, I don't think what's going on in Gaza can be characterized as genocide. Um, but but the fact that this International Association of Genocide Scholars has rushed in and declared this, and then everybody's celebrating this as this is fantastic. But as I said, if you go down this path of characterizing something as genocide, anything that's very horrible, and there's no question what being done is horrific in Gaza. But if you say, oh, well, that's genocide, you're opening the door to this vast network of NGOs and governments who are always chomping at the bit to characterize everything that they don't like as genocide. Remember when Antony Blinken was testifying? Well, he wasn't testifying. He was appearing for his confirmation hearings. Somebody says, "Okay, why aren't they genocide? Because they're not all dead yet." Yeah, that you're on the right path. Yeah, that I mean, the question with genocide is that you always have two key ingredients, which is you have to have the actions that involve obviously the annihilation of a people, and then you have the clear intent on the part of those who are carrying out these atrocities, the clear intent to wipe out a people from existence. And I don't think we are there yet. Now, the people who are always jumping on this genocide label, they do it on every issue. Every single time there's anything that happens, they're jumping on it. Now, so just going back to what I said about Blinken said that what the Chinese are doing to the Uyghurs was genocide. Well, he just said it's genocide. They're doing. You don't like the Chinese government, therefore, whatever it's doing was genocide. Then you had, remember Colin Powell? You've forgotten Colin Powell. He said, "Oh well, what's going on in Darfur is genocide." And then, of course, the granddaddy of them all, the genocide, was, of course, Srebrenica and Bosnia and Herzegovina. What happened there was that they used that label, genocide. Essentially, I mean, if you're talking about genocide, it's being used to crush, brutally crush the Serbian people, because they are now tainted forever by this term genocide. And that's the whole point. Now, here is this International Association of Genocide Scholars. So here's a wire story about it. And says the leading genocide scholars organization says Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. And they said the largest organization of scholars in studying genocide said Monday that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. The determination by this international association of genocide scholars, which has around 500 members worldwide, including a number of Holocaust experts, could serve to further isolate Israel in global public opinion. Now, this association is very much in the business of building a brand and very much in the business of extracting money from all sorts of governments. That's what governments do, because governments use this term genocide in order to go after their adversaries. And so here it goes on. Israel's policies and actions in Gaza meet the legal definition of genocide according to the group's resolution, which was supported by 86% of those who voted. The organization did not release the specifics of the voting. And then it said, and then he goes on. The Scholars Group, founded in 1994. Oh, 1994. Of course, that was the heyday of genocide mania. Remember, that was the time when it was proclaimed with no evidence whatsoever, starting in 1992, that genocide was taking place in Bosnia. So that was 3 years before Srebrenica. And of course, no genocide took place in Srebrenica. That's a lie from start to finish. Even though it's now been enshrined, by all of the organizations, all the museums and everything, Srebrenica, it's a genocide. But 1994 was just shortly after the establishment of those ad hoc tribunals by the UN Security Council, the Yugoslav Tribunal, and then the Rwanda Tribunal, and the only way they could get the tribunals really to have the resonance that they wanted, and they were creations of the Western powers, was through declaring that political leaders were engaged in genocide. If it was just simply war crimes or crimes against humanity, violations of the laws of war, no one's going to do that. No one's going to be interested in that. You needed to have something fundamental, and that was genocide. And so that became that was Madeleine Albright and the UN Security Council. So they started saying from 1992 that genocide was taking place in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And then of course they seized on Rwanda. There was no genocide in Rwanda either. That was also a lie. And then here, it says this was founded in 1994. Has previously held that China's treatment of the Muslim Uyghurs and Myanmar's crackdown on Rohingya Muslims meet the threshold for genocide. So before Israel, you already declared that the Chinese are guilty of genocide and that the Myanmar has committed genocide. In 2006, the organization sent statements by then Israel President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, in which he called for Israel to be wiped off the map. He didn't call for that. Had genocidal intent. So now we're getting somewhere with this forum, because Ahmadinejad said nothing of the sort. We know that was a mistranslation. And yet, they're scholars. They are, men and women who are buried in the archives. They're buried, investigating the most terrible crimes known to man, and yet none of them try to get an accurate translation of what Ahmadinejad said. But if you look then at, what's he been doing? So here is this resolution on the situation in Gaza. It says, declares that Israel's policies and actions on Gaza meet the legal definition of genocide in Article 2 of the crime of genocide. But you can say what you like. I mean, that you're not able to declare it until there has been some um, you got to you have to, before you do that, you have to at least have some kind of proper investigation. You have to say that before you make all the declaration that that was exactly what's happening here. But as I say, you don't have that right now. It might could change, but at the moment, what you can have certainly crimes against humanity, crimes that are against the laws of war, but genocide is something very, very specific. And you have a very high hurdle. That was the point about that convention. You have to have a very high hurdle before you can declare something to be genocide. But, for all sorts of opportunistic people, including this international association, seize on this and proclaim almost anything genocide. Now let's look at the record. So here they're going to Putin. Statement on the situation in Ukraine. The International Association of Genocide Scholars Executive Board strongly condemns Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the justification for this attack. Russian President Vladimir Putin has claimed that the invasion is justified under an allegation of Ukraine committing genocide against Russian-speaking citizens. Putin is misappropriating and misusing the term genocide to justify invading a sovereign state. Well, actually, I agree with that. I mean, I think it was completely mischaracterized. I don't think anybody should be misusing that term. And the Russians were misusing it. Again, they were just using it in a very haphazard way that everybody else does. There's no evidence of genocide being committed by Ukraine against Russian-speaking citizens, and such claims have been exposed by independent observers as baseless, even fabricated. But Putin, at the same time, was using genocide in the way that these very scholars have been using, and the ones who proclaim that there was genocide in Srebrenica. Well, if you can say that was genocide in Srebrenica, then why can't you say there's genocide here? And then Putin's justification is another example of the manipulation by government official and political leaders of the term genocide to serve political purposes. Yeah, that's kind of, and who's actually doing it? Well, U.S. government official. And then he says, Ukrainian populations have faced genocide in the 20th century. Oh, really? In the form of the Holodomor, the Ukrainian famine re-extermination in 1932 to 33. Well, that wasn't genocide. I mean, that was a famine, but there was no genocide. And for the obvious reason. Now, these are scholars. And you expect scholars to be a little bit more meticulous in the way they make their definition. So if you're going to say that was genocide, you have to then come up with the evidence. You have to have the evidence on the part of Stalin and the key figures in the Kremlin that they intended to exterminate the Ukrainian people. Nobody has come up with any evidence. None, zero. Whatever happened in Ukraine is very similar to what happened in Russia, what happened in Kazakhstan. The bad collectivization policy. What happened in Ukraine wasn't any worse than what was happening in southern Russia and in Kazakhstan. The collectivization policy had been an absolute catastrophe. But if these scholars declare that was genocide, the Holodomor was genocide, then you have to show, according to that very convention, that very genocide convention that they cite, that there was an intent to wipe out the Ukrainian people. And then he says, and the Holocaust under Operation Barbarossa, including the Babi Yar massacre, survivors of which live in Ukraine today. I don't know, how survivors live? Okay. Well, then you say Ukrainian populations. Well, that's very strange. But why are they singling out Ukrainian populations? I mean, the Nazis were conducting their mass executions for Barbarossa, really, um, pretty much where they went. The executions were far more extensive in what is now Belarus than they were in Ukraine. The executions went on in Russia. Wherever they went, there were these mass executions. Um, and mostly they targeted Jews and commissars. So why they suddenly say it was the Ukrainians that they single out, particularly as these executions that took place in Babi Yar were carried out by Ukrainians. It was the Ukrainian auxiliaries that were being used by the Nazis to carry out these mass executions. Ukrainians were carrying out these executions. And yet this International Association of Genocide Scholars suggests that it was Ukrainians who were the victims of this genocide at the hands of somebody else. And they don't spell who it is. They say very Barbarossa, but in fact, I mean, it was the people carrying out these executions were themselves Ukrainians. Anyway, so they go on. Darfur, Darfur. So the International Association of Scholars weighed in on Darfur. What a surprise. We, the leadership and membership of the International Association of Genocide Scholars, a worldwide professional association of experts on genocide, call upon the United Nations to authorize. So they call upon the United Nations to authorize a coalition of member states to organize and deploy a robust armed intervention force in Darfur in order to stop the ongoing war crimes, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, and genocide being perpetrated by the government of Sudan troops and the Janjaweed Arab militias against Black African ethnic groups in Darfur. So they're in the whole responsibility to protect, humanitarian intervention mode of thought. And then we have the International Association of Genocide Scholars resolution condemning Iranian President Ahmadinejad's statement calling for the destruction of Israel and denying the historical reality of the Holocaust and calling for the prevention of Iranian development of nuclear weapons. Why are these the International Association of Genocide Scholars calling for the prevention of Iranian development of nuclear weapons? We, the leadership and membership of the blah blah, worldwide professional blah blah blah, had openly aggressive statements by the president of Iran, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, calling for Israel to be wiped off the map and inciting students to scream death to Israel at a government-sponsored conference on 26th of October 2005. Now, as I said, Ahmadinejad did not say that. He didn't call for Israel to be wiped off the map. He said that it's a kind of a historic aberration that will one day, disappear. It's no different from the case of Ronald Reagan talking about that communism will be dumped into the ash heap of history. So he was saying that ethnic racist ethnic supremacy state will eventually disappear. He didn't call for it to be wiped off the map. He didn't say, hey, everybody pile onto Israel and wipe it off and wipe it out of existence. He said that this ethnically supreme state will eventually no longer exist. And then he said, Ahmadinejad publicly denied the Holocaust and declared it a myth created by Europeans to justify creation of a Jewish state in the heart of the Islamic world. Well, that's a historic interpretation. You can disagree, but I mean, that's okay. I mean, there's clearly definite facts to support his case, which was that the creation of the state of Israel was in response to what had happened to the Jews in Europe. And there was a great feeling of guilt and so on. And, that feeling of guilt by Christian Europeans had led to the Balfour Declaration and had led to the creation of this Jewish national homeland in Palestine. And then so that then guilt about World War II had led to the creation of the state of Israel. Well, okay. I mean, you may not like somebody saying that, but that's certainly an argument. And Ahmadinejad said, well, why should we have to pay for the crimes of someone else? I mean, that was his argument. Why should Muslims in Palestine be made to suffer for somebody else's crimes? I mean, if these crimes were committed by Germany, then why don't we create a Jewish state in Germany? Why do we get a Jewish state here in the Middle East? As in response to something that Germany did to the Jews. Anyway, it says, since President Ahmadinejad took office, Iran has refused to heed the calls by the International Atomic Energy Agency to reestablish full suspension of its uranium enrichment activities, and has restarted programs to develop Iranian capacity to enrich uranium. So why are they going on about this that could be used for nuclear weapons, which, as I say, everybody knows, something the CIA said they gave up on their plans for developing nuclear weapons, I think in 2003. But why is this International Association of Genocide Scholars weighing in on this? Anyway, so, and then it says, early warning signs of genocide. You see, warning signs of genocide. So apparently there are signs of it. Include open expressions of an exclusionary ideology, hate speech. Oh, that's hate speech. But he hasn't said anything that's hate speech. I mean, that's what the scholars say was hate speech. Denial of past genocide. I don't see that but they call that a warning sign of genocide. So if you're denying past genocide, which I think is part of academic debate, there's nothing at all wrong with people, debating what really happened. But notice they already say that's an early warning sign of genocide. Authoritarian government that represses dissent. Well, there's plenty of those governments around. Arrest of Iranian moderates. Organization of fanatical militias, and program to develop weapons of mass destruction. All of these are early warning signs of genocide that are evident in Iran today. What does any of this gibberish got to do with genocide? None. This is the International Association of Genocide Scholars, the one that everybody's now quoting today as if there's some sort of real authoritative experts whose pontifications and expertise and learning and investigations are worth listening to. I mean, this is just gibberish. Direct and public expressions of genocidal intent by a national leader, coupled with a clear and present danger that genocidal acts will be committed, is incitement to genocide. What clear and present danger that genocidal acts will be committed? When has Iran ever indicated that it will be committing genocidal acts? I mean, Iran was under attack. I mean, we're not talking about what happened recently because this was in 2005 or 2006. But up until then, Iran had come under attack by Iraq, led to a very, very nasty war. But this was an attack sponsored by the United States, but other Western powers. They all supported Iraq's invasion. And then, of course, the United States imposed, through the UN, terrible sanctions. But none of that, apparently, that the scholars do not pay much attention to that. The risk of genocide against Israel is not yet imminent, but once Iran has nuclear weapons, it will be. Why? I mean, notice how this absolute garbage. 2006, Israel has nuclear weapons. Iran doesn't. But apparently that isn't a threat to anyone. Of course, it's not a threat to anyone. However, if Iran, in response to Israel having nuclear weapons, thinks we need to have nuclear weapons of our own, which is the normal response, normal defensive response, that apparently is genocidal, and that they intend to use a nuclear weapon against Israel rather than they want to have a nuclear weapon to defend themselves against Israel. I mean, this is a fairly obvious point, but instead they put out this nonsense to suggest that the only reason Iran might want to have nuclear weapons is in order to commit genocide against Israel. When genocide intent is open, express, and means to commit genocide are being prepared, the precautionary principle places the burden of proof on those who deny that genocide will be committed. No, the burden of proof is on those who insist that they have evidence of genocidal intent. That's the way it works. It's not, the burden of proof is not on those who deny that genocide will be committed. A fairly obvious point. One doesn't have to be a lawyer to understand that point. The burden of proof is on those who claim that a power is genocidal, not on those who deny that genocide will be committed. Because no genocide has been committed. Iran has not committed genocide against anyone and has not threatened anyone, and basically has never waged war against anyone. We therefore call upon the UN Security Council to determine that Iran's nuclear program poses a threat to international peace and to take the following diplomatic and economic actions under Chapter 7, blah, blah. Direct the IAEA to demand immediate and continuing IAEA inspections, require Iran to suspend its programs, and prohibit transfers of Iran of all equipment and materials. So notice how they're very much in that kind of mainstream denunciations of Iran. This is exactly what the George W. Bush administration was saying. Anyway, Syria. 2012, Syria. The International Association of Genocide Scholars calls on the Syrian government to cease all attacks against civilians. The regime of President Bashar al-Assad is inflicting crimes against humanity, possibly verging on genocide. So it's amazing how genocide, you can have early signs of genocide, and now we have possibly verging on genocide upon the Syrian civilian population. So that was nice. That was, of course, again, it gave them a nice little bit of publicity. So Syria is also in the genocide business. This includes the state-sponsored slaughter of thousands of civilians by state security forces over the past year, and the disappearance of thousands more. So they were, in the business of these wild allegations that state sponsor of slaughter of thousands of civilians. And those alleged to be responsible for mass atrocities should be turned over to the International Criminal Court. Even though Syria had never accepted the jurisdiction of the Syrian International Criminal Court. And then, of course, the International Association calls on the international community, notably the United Nations, Arab League, and other peacekeeping forces to take all necessary measures to protect Syrian civilians. So essentially, just before that, I didn't read the paragraph before. The International Association of Genocide Scholars urges the United Nations, Arab League, major governmental and non-governmental organizations to recognize the vulnerability of these groups to genocidal attack and call on all actors in the Syrian conflict to respect their rights and livelihood. Before that, it says the International Association condemns all attempts to obstruct international efforts to aid and protect Syrian civilians. It likewise cautions that a general chaos or an extremist regime may pose a general danger for Syrian minority groups, including the Alawite and Circassian Christian populations. But no mention, of course, is that the Syrian government was the protector of the Alawite and the Circassian Christian populations. And here's the Rohingya. The resolution to declare the Rohingya persecution a crime of genocide. So these genocides are kind of piling up now. This is all just really in recent years. Whereas Myanmar has a long history of discrimination against the Rohingya people based on their identity and religious beliefs and so on, whereas discriminatory policies against a specific group have also included population control, such as household registration, whereas the above mentioned oppressive policies had the purpose of systematically othering of the Rohingya. Othering, oh, that's a good one. Othering of Rohingya people in the Myanmar nation with a clear exclusionist objective. And so, whereas of tooth and blah blah, and it goes on and on, and then therefore the International Association of Genocide Scholars recognizes the crimes committed against the Rohingya in 2017 in Myanmar as genocide and crimes against humanity, urges the international community to provide humanitarian assistance to the refugees located in Bangladesh, including but not limited to proper shelter and so on. And then, of course, it calls upon the International Criminal Court to provide effective and rapid justice to the victims, clarification of the facts, and punishment of the perpetrators. Okay, so that's a Rohingya, and then of course we've got Bangladesh. They're going back a long way, but this is they're just going way back. Declare almost anything. We went back to the Holodomor, 1932. Now we're going back to the war, the Bangladesh War of 1971. That also genocide. Whereas prior to the 1971 Liberation War, East Pakistan, today's Bangladesh, was under the rule of West Pakistan in the aftermath of the British colonial partition, 1947. Whereas during that period of time, under a second colonial rule, discriminatory policies against Bengalis, both Hindus and Muslims, were established, such as prohibitions to speak Bangla, imposition of Urdu as an official language, and the violent persecution of repression of dissidents and social movements. Defending the representative of the Bengali identity and character. And then again, they're talking about the Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. If you recall, the language. It was the Sheikh Mujibur Rahman's movement was a protest against the language that they were being forced to study in Urdu rather than in Bengali. He swept the elections, and the idiots in West Pakistan, instead of trying to accommodate Rahman, they just went in and decided, well, we're going to crack down on this the Awami League. We're going to put all their leaders in prison and so on. But it wasn't genocide. When you do something as stupid as that, there's going to be a lot of atrocities. But they have to build everything up as genocide. Whereas evidence supports the crimes committed against the Bengalis during 1971 were widespread and systematic, carried out by the Pakistani army, and so on. Therefore, the International Association of Genocide Scholars recognizes the crimes committed against the Bengali population in 1971 as genocide. Okay, so that's another one. And then, Iraq. Well, that's good. So we're on to Iraq. Recognizing that Iraq is a state party to the Genocide Convention and thereby has obligations to prevent and punish genocide. Therefore, the International Association of Genocide Scholars declares that the atrocities perpetrated by the Iraq government of Saddam Hussein and by ISIS against the Kurds constituted genocide and crimes against humanity, condemns the genocides and crimes against humanity committed by the Iraq government of Saddam Hussein, calls upon the government of Iraq to fully implement the Yazidi survivors' law, carry out the process of reparations, and so on, calls upon the United Nations, national governments, and international human rights organizations to recognize the atrocities perpetrated against the Kurds and other Kurdish Iraqi minority groups by Saddam Hussein regime and by ISIS as genocide, and then so on. And here's the 2025 conference, which is taking place, I guess, in a few weeks' time in October. It's going to be in South Africa. The challenge of never again engaging with protection and preventing genocide. And then here we are, 5-day conference. So that's a long conference. The call for papers is being drafted. However, the theme is the challenge of never again engaging with the protection and prevention of genocide, and will tie into 2025 being 80 years post World War II, 20th anniversary of responsibility to protect, and the 30th anniversary of Srebrenica. All right, so you get the point. So if you're going to, they're ready, of course, to declare Srebrenica as genocide, and that was, I mean, at least the official claim, and the official claim is nonsense. I mean, they've never really had come up with evidence, but that there were 8,000 executions of Serbian men and boys, which is kind of strange also when you have genocide, because you have genocide, you basically you kill everybody. But if it's men and boys, you think, well, that already sounds like men who are kind of fighting, fighting age men, and so therefore it already sounds a very strange way of calling it genocide. And of course it wasn't, but they needed that, because without Srebrenica, the ICTY had really nothing, and pretty much all of the whatever evidence that they had collected had not indicated that there was anything like a genocide taking place. So they had to pick on the Srebrenica and then create this fantasy world, this total sculpture made of air called the Srebrenica genocide. Now, the point that I'm making in bringing all this up is that you've got to be very careful that when you embrace this, who exactly are you aligning yourself with? You're aligning yourself with a big international grift. This is Soros. These are the Sorosites. There's big money in all of this. Huge amounts of government funding to these kinds of International Association of Genocide Scholars, lawyers who purport to be genocide lawyers, investigating war crimes. They're all in the business of prosecuting war crimes. Amazing. None of them is in the interest of defending anyone who's accused of war crimes. They're all in the business of prosecution. And what's most important is they get a lot of money, big money from governments, chiefly the EU governments, chiefly from the NATO governments, chiefly from the United States, and from all of the Sorosite NGOs. So it's a grift. You got a 5-day conference in Johannesburg. That's a lot. That you get one of those things going. That's a lavishly funded institution. So my point is, don't be taken in by this kind of thing. Just think about what genocide is supposed to be. Think about whether what the evidence is for a systematic elimination of a people, and then think about what the evidence that you're going to need to adduce that there is such an intent for a systematic elimination of a people, and then we can talk. Now, what they're doing here is, as I say, I mean, if you're ready to call Holodomor a genocide, even though you don't have any evidence at all, the Stalin or the leaders in the Kremlin intended to wipe out the Ukrainian people, particularly given that the Bolsheviks had actually created Ukraine and they had promoted Ukrainian nationalism. They had actually um, elevated the Ukrainians in Ukraine above the Russians of Ukraine. So that would be very strange. Why, it never made any sense. Why would Stalin want to genocide the very people that the Bolsheviks had promoted? So it never really made a great deal of sense. Um, but that's the point. I mean, if you're going to go down that path of saying now, see, someone said Israel has been committing genocide since 1948. You could say Israel has been committing horrific crimes since 1948. You can say that. Why can't you just simply say horrific crimes since 1948? I agree with all that. Israel has been committing crimes against humanity, if you're going to use that term, since 1948. But genocide is a very specific term, and it's supposed to have a very high level of of proof before you can do it. As it happened, the moment the Madeleine Albright and all those people in the early 90s was seized on these tribunals, and then of course in the creating the International Criminal Court, they needed genocide. It was the very heart of that project. The project of the responsibility to protect, the project of the humanitarian intervention. They needed genocide at its core, because they knew that just crimes against humanity, it wasn't going to do it. They knew that violation of the laws of war wasn't going to do it. So they needed genocide. And then to do that, they had to continue to lower the level of proof necessary to establish genocide. And then they can just simply go and, convict this person of genocide, convict that person of genocide. Just became very easy. Even though they had no evidence, like, the people they've committed, that Radovan Karadzic, the Bosnian Serb president, genocide, Ratko Mladic, the commander of the Bosnian Serb armed forces, genocide, and of course they would have done it to Milosevic. They had no evidence for any of that, that's what happens when you go down this the genocide racket. Anyway, let's look at some of the comments by our gagglers, the people who make sure that the dogs are in a good mood, because they're not in a good mood. They're in a foul mood. But having a few contributions into the tip jar puts them into into a somewhat better mood. No, not with me. I mean, they despise me, but at least they puts them in a better mood when it comes to the gagglers. Anyway, Marty says, but the days grow short when you reach September. Yeah, that's a very, very, yeah, that's a very maudlin song. Yeah, it depresses me. I don't like listening to that song because it just simply depresses me so much. And it's a long, long time. Ugh, God, yeah. You're absolutely right. That's it's. I guess it should be my theme song. Um, thank you so much as always. And then Dennis Misty says, yes, the autumn golds swim overhead and open up a new season. Who needs this damn season? I don't need it. Um, and then anyway, Dennis Misty then goes on. I was traveling post from Tiflis. The only luggage I had on my cart was one small portmanteau, half filled with travel notes on Georgia. Luckily for you, most of them have been lost, but luckily for me, the portmanteau and the rest of my things have survived. Well, I guess, I mean, I'm sorry that your note, you've lost your notes. That's actually quite annoying. But at least you have your portmanteau, and so anyway, that's something. Stone River, thank you so much for your generosity. Really, really appreciate that. Ooh, Mertz. So Marty posted a short video on our locals page of Mertz clumsily dropping his dessert, um, somewhere or other, and it was kind of a very, very odd thing. I mean, he has that kind of somewhat awkwardness. He's very tall, and it sometimes happens that very tall people are uh, uh, are awkward. But it looked. He did look somewhat ridiculous. You can see it on the locals page, and then I said somewhat facetiously, since we're talking about who's the worst chancellor in Germany, and I think we all agreed that the competition is for who's the second worst chancellor. The worst has already been taken. And then I said, well, at least Hitler managed to eat his cake without dropping it on the floor. So anyway, thank you so much, Marty, for that picture of Schmerz. Cynthia, always very good to see you. And Cynthia says September Song was featured in the 1950 drama film September Affair, starring Joan Fontaine and Joseph Compton. I didn't know that. I thought that was a self-contained song. Somebody wrote that. I didn't know it was written for a film. They fall in love and are pressured and are presumed dead, but the former wife doesn't give up on him. Actually, that song was originally featured. Oh, so it was originally featured in the 1938 musical Knickerbocker Holiday, which explores themes of corruption, tyranny, and the importance of peace over war. But other than that, I don't know much about else of the film. Okay, but it seems to you know quite a lot: corruption, tyranny, and the importance of peace over war. Knickerbocker Holiday. Um, I mean, it's right. The way you describe it is quite interesting. I mean, it's the importance of peace over war. And it's 1938. Because it reminds me of a film, very odd film, also made I think around 1938, Idiot's Delight, with Clark Gable, and that's the famous one where Clark Gable does a song and dance number, putting on the Ritz. But the theme there also, it's peace over war, and the whole idea is we need to stop war, which was it's a very interesting. Listen, you're thinking, oh, 1938, that's Hitler. Everybody wants to deal with Hitler. Everybody wants to say we got to go take out Hitler. We have to, you know, defend Czechoslovakia, defend Poland, or whatever. We got to do. But this film, Idiot's Delight, the thing is, we need to avoid war. We have to stop war. There's no reference at all to Germany and to Nazism, to Hitler or anything. It's war. The war is the big threat. And the villain of the film, was not Hitler or the Nazis. The villain of the film, I think played by Edward Arnold, if I remember, was, of course, the Merchant of Death. They're the villains, the Merchants of Death. These are the horrible arms dealers, because war is always about arms dealers. So it's a very interesting perspective. This is Hollywood. That even Hollywood in 1938, 39 was we don't want to go into a war. We want to stay out of war. We're not interested, what you think of Hitler. You're not interested in Nazism or anything like that. We just have to stay out of the war. So and that's a very interesting perspective, because we all assume that the issues of the 1930s is, oh well, we got to take on Nazis, and then you have these terrible appeasers who don't want to fight Germany. But this is Hollywood itself is saying the evil is war, and the only people who want war are the arms merchants, and that was the view. That was absolutely the view between during the years between the wars, that the only reason for World War One, or the Great War as it was known at the time, the only reason was that the arms dealers wanted to make a lot of money. They sell arms to everybody, and that's how you get war. And therefore, that's the theme of. And I don't know about Knickerbocker Holiday, whether that's the theme of Knickerbocker Holiday. It was the theme of Idiot's Delight, which is that we have to deal with the evils of the arms merchants. But that just shows how quickly uh, uh, public opinion changed. Um, and um, and then Cynthia goes on. It says In April, the U.S. deployed its Typhoon weapon system in the Philippines, which targets China. And in a few days, the U.S. is also going to be deploying this weapon system to Japan, but it'll be targeting not only China, but Russia as well. Since this weapon system is capable of carrying nuclear warheads, it's perfectly understandable why both China and Russia see this as a U.S. weapon system as a major security threat. Um, and then it goes on. But why would the Philippines and Japan put themselves in the crosshairs of two opposing great powers, especially since the U.S. is no longer substantially more powerful than China, and now China has a sufficiently strong alliance with Russia? Wouldn't it be better for both Philippines and Japan to become neutral in this conflict? But if they're dead set on picking sides, shouldn't they pick a side that's most likely to win this conflict, unless they're asking for a death sentence, of course? Well, that's very, very interesting. Now, the Philippines and Japan are, of course, simply American satellites. I mean, that's what they become. So they don't have too much of a say in the deployments of weapon systems. So, the United States gets to do whatever it wants. That was the deal done with Japan and the Philippines after the war. I'm not sure that Japan and Philippines think that China is, as you put it, is that China is, you said the U.S. is no longer substantially more powerful than China. The U.S. is substantially more powerful than China. The U.S. is militarily, much stronger than China. U.S. of course has much more in the way of nuclear missiles, nuclear launchers, and everything else. I mean, China just doesn't have anything comparable to the United States. However, that's not really that important, because the whole point is that nobody can be sure that you can take out all of us a country's nuclear capabilities in a first strike, because that's the key. If that's what creates instability, is if one side has the ability to strike first and eliminate all of the adversary's retaliatory capabilities. So that's the so-called first strike capability. And ultimately, no nuclear power thinks that it has yet that first strike capability, but it's something that they're all working on. That was the whole point of the ABM treaty, was that no one would build ballistic missile defense system, and that would guarantee that that no power would have a first strike capability. That they would, therefore, if you use nuclear weapons to attack someone, whoever, if that's a nuclear power, the nuclear power will be able to retaliate. So, United States or the Soviet Union would know that the adversary would have the ability to retaliate. So, therefore, it didn't make any sense to launch a nuclear attack. And I think that's the case with China. So China is not the equal of the United States, but it has a retaliatory capability, and the United States is not in the position, though it's working on it. I mean, the United States is absolutely working on. I mean, it walked away from the ABM treaty in 2002, and it has been working for the past 20 years on missile defenses. And maybe at some point it will have a foolproof missile defense system that can protect the United States against a Russian attack or a Chinese attack. So that is destabilizing, but that's in a way spilled milk now. There's no way the United States would ever agree to going back to any kind of an ABM treaty. So they go, they're working on ballistic missile defenses, as is, of course, Russia. Everyone has to now work on ballistic missile defense systems. I also wouldn't agree that there's a strong alliance with Russia. It's certainly not a military alliance. They're certainly not committed in any military way to one another's security. In fact, they've pointedly shown that they're not, they have good relations, but it's mostly um, at the level of trade relations. They signed a big gas deal today, so they have, that's big bucks for Russia. Um, and China lends Russia certain diplomatic support. I mean, this Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting in China, whereas I don't think much of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. I don't think it does anything. Nonetheless, it is a demonstration of that Russia has friends in this world. I wouldn't call them allies. China and India are not allies, but they are friends. So while the West talks about Putin's isolation, Russia's isolated, well, Russia obviously isn't isolated. So even though the Shanghai Cooperation Organization doesn't really do very much, I mean, can't see what it's actually done ever since its existence, other than it's like a talking shop. They have these meetings and make all these declarations about multipolarity. We're against the unipolar world, but the fact is that they don't actually do anything. I mean, anything that would be meaningful. I mean, it's like, what's the Shanghai Cooperation Organization doing about the war in Gaza? Nada. What's it doing about Syria? I mean, since this war started in Syria in 2012, it hasn't done anything. I mean, even to the extent that the Russians were involved in some kind of a trying to settle the Syrian war. Russia was doing that unilaterally or through the Astana process, and the Astana process didn't do anything either. So, but the Shanghai Cooperation Organization didn't do anything. What did the Shanghai Cooperation Organization do in Afghanistan? Also, nothing. I mean, the war went on for 20 years without any effective intervention by the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And then today, we have Iran, a direct threat from the United States, from the Europeans at the UN Security Council, that the sanctions are going to snap back in place in October, which is going to be quite painful. An obvious injustice, since Iran hasn't done anything wrong, and Iran could also come under attack from Israel in the name of enforcing some UN Security Council resolution. I mean, Israel doesn't need too many excuses to attack Iran, but after the sanctions snap back in place, Israel can cite the justification of a UN Security Council resolution to attack Iran. Well, what's the Shanghai Cooperation Organization doing about that? Even though Iran is now a member of the SCO. So I'm not really very impressed with it. However, it does show that Russia is not isolated. Russia does have friends. And that, there is a rest of the world. But it's one thing to say, yes, there's a rest of the world, there's the West and there is a rest of the world. Another thing to say that somehow the rest of the world is stronger than the West, or is in any way rivals the West. I mean, almost like there's none of these problems that I just mentioned, and there's others. None of them can be resolved without the United States. I mean, that it's the United States that holds the key to all of these issues, and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is just an observer. So I think. Anyway, then Cynthia goes on. Also, among all of the countries with a territory in South China Sea, the Philippines is by far the most aggressive country, butting heads with China over the side. Yeah, they have. Absolutely, you're absolutely right. They've done that. And they've had reasonable grounds to do so. I mean, they think, hey, China's kind of building these artificial islands in the South China Sea, and others have complained about this. Vietnam has complained about this, and the East China Sea, that essentially these islands that China is creating, they're military islands. But of course, the Philippines they can't really take on China. But I think that's an important point, that some of China's neighbors do have issues with China. And they just don't really like Chinese military bases surrounding them. In fact, besides Taiwan, neither of these the other two countries with territory in the South China Sea, Vietnam and Malaysia, are aligning themselves with the U.S. against China over this territorial dispute. Well, they have complained. I mean, they have complained with China. I mean, they don't intend to go to war against China, but they have raised complaints with China. I mean, Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia have raised complaints with China militarizing the South China Sea and militarizing the East China Sea. So they have done that. I mean, they don't want to get into a war with China, because obviously, I mean, that would only have one outcome. Yeah, but there's no question. I mean, they do regard China as problematic, and as do others. I mean, India has had tense relations with China. I mean, they're not going to go to war, but they have tense border disputes. So but they're also members of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and members of BRICS, but that's in effect, one of the reasons why the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and BRICS are relatively ineffective is that you've put together a whole bunch of countries that have all sorts of different interests, and so it's very hard to get any kind of a cohesive alliance and a coherent agenda put forward, because they do have disputes among one another. And that's why I don't take it seriously in the way you look at NATO. That's a military alliance. That's a military alliance. That's an integrated military command. Everybody in NATO follows the orders issued by the high command, which is the United States. That's we can make fun of NATO and so on, but that's a serious entity. It's sufficiently serious that Russia took it seriously, and it takes seriously NATO's encroachments, and they should. But compare that with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which also supposed to deal with security. I mean, there's no military command there. I mean, let alone an integrated military command. Compare that with the Collective Security Treaty Organization, which is a kind of another version of NATO. I mean, the measure of the Collective Security Treaty Organization is that Armenia is a member of it, even though Armenia basically takes no part in anything that it does. And Armenia is in any case pissed off that the Collective Security Treaty Organization did nothing to help Armenia against Azerbaijan, which is not a member of the CSTO. So, that's why I just don't see them as in any way rivals to all of the institutions that the West has. I mean, when you get these Western powers together, they all sing from the same script. And they're absolutely unambiguous when they make their declaration, when they intervene in other countries' affairs and various international crises, that they're all have a distinctive agenda. So it's much more than what happens at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, where you just make these nice speeches. Yeah, we want multipolarity. Sign me up for multipolarity. Where do I get one of those? But that's a long way from being any kind of a rival to the West. I mean, that might change, but every time we have these meetings, you get all these Pepe Escobars who start, rhapsodizing about how the whole world has changed and there's a new power block and so on. I mean, here you've got, on one hand, you have NATO, quite a menacing organization. You got NATO, warlike, war-provoking organization. And then you have the G7, which is kind of almost equivalent to NATO, and you don't really have anything comparable on the other side. I mean, BRICS. They've been talking about other things like having issuing a new currency, a reserve currency, and so on. I mean, that hasn't happened. I mean, now they're talking about an alternative to SWIFT, the SWIFT payment system, and maybe that'll happen. I mean, but we're still some way from that. But you know, before you do anything like that, before you start, challenging, the Western hegemony, there's an awful lot of steps that you have to go through, and and China will not want to go through all those steps. Anyway, thank you so much, Cynthia. And I should also say, Cynthia, because she brought up all these issues about film. She's our resident film expert, our resident film scholar, and so when you watch the Gaggle film screenings, which we have on Monday nights, we had yesterday. What was the film? The film yesterday, yes, The Return of Martin Guerre, very interesting film. But watch that film, a really good film, and then of course read Cynthia's really fascinating observations and background information. And I always learn so much from Cynthia's commentary. So it's a rare treat for Gagglers that we have this expert among us, and who's able to enlighten us on so many things about the history of cinema. So please watch the movie, and above all, read Cynthia's commentary. So anyway, thank you so much, Cynthia. And then Dennis Misty, thank you so much, Dennis. Dennis Misty says, recent contemporary English penguins of Turgenev should indeed be recycled. I haven't read that, but I can imagine that's the case. It's very, very odd that they do these new translations of classics that are greatly inferior to previous translations. I'm all for having new translations, because some of the translations in the past were very poor. The translators were kind of well-meaning amateurs who didn't know the language well enough, and so they did things. And I think that happened. I mean, some of the early translators of Dostoevsky were not very good. I mean, like Constance Garnett and so on. So it needed new translations. But then you have really lousy translations, which are actually much worse than the previous one. Now, in let's say the case of Proust, there was the Scott Moncrief and Terence Kilmartin translation, and it had the famous title, which was A Remembrance of Things Past, which wasn't an exact translation from Proust. And so this new translation, which came out, I guess, maybe about 10, 15 years ago, said, oh, we'll do better than that. And so the title they had is In Search of Lost Time. Now, that's a literal translation from the title in French, but it doesn't mean anything in English. I mean, there is no such thing as lost time, In Search of Lost Time. So the original translation, Remembrance of Things Past, was correct. That means something, and which is what happened. But In Search of Lost Time is already leaves the reader baffled. What is lost time? And the translation was worse than the Scott Moncrief, Terence Kilmartin. So I'm quite sure that that's the case. That that the two, even though I haven't read the Turgenev, that they are worse. I mean, even like let's say Kafka, the translation, the first translation, but Willer and Edwin Muir, was much better than the ones that came subsequently. Because Kafka's not a difficult writer to translate. His German was very simple. It's not like Thomas Mann, whose German was very difficult, and so I think that's why the woman who did the translation again was a labor of love, Porter, but her German really just wasn't good enough um, fully to understand Mann's nuances, and so she got things wrong. Um, but that's not the case with Kafka, because Kafka, he wrote in a very simple, straightforward way. So that translation of Wille Edwin Muir was very good. So if you think of the trial, that opening sentence, which Wille and Edwin Muir have, like someone must have been spreading rumors about Joseph K. because without having done anything wrong, he found himself arrested one fine morning. I mean, it's almost like magical. I mean, your opening sentence, somebody must have been spreading rumors about Joseph K. Now, it wasn't exactly the German. That wasn't how the original German was, but the spirit, what the Will and Edwin Muir do, they call it the spirit. So you got the new translation saying someone must have traduced Joseph K. because without having done anything wrong, he found himself arrested one fine morning. But you put a word like traduced. Who the hell uses a word like traduced? I mean, how can you do a translation? Traduced is infinitely worse than saying someone must have been spreading rumors about Joseph K. So, yeah, newer translations are often, you know, inferior to the older translations. Anyway, thank you so much, Dennis. And then Dennis goes on, just wasted a few weeks plowing through Susan Woodward's Balkan tragedy, a diary without perspective. Yes. Now, that book, it's very hard to read. There's information there, but it's not at all well written. It is almost indigestible. But she deals with some of the economic aspects of the breakup of Yugoslavia, and which very few people did. But it's very hard to get through. I mean, it's just indigestible. I mean, it's like it's you're almost like you feel like hitting your head because it's so hard to read. Needless to say, if you want to read about the Balkan tragedy, then the book you need to read is, of course, the book written by me, George Samueli, and it's known as Bombs for Peace, NATO's Humanitarian War in Yugoslavia, which, even if I say so myself, is better than Woodward's Balkan tragedy. Anyway, thank you so much, Dennis. And then Cynthia asks, so what are some historical examples of mass murder that actually meet the real definition of genocide? Well, that's an excellent question. And I would probably then select the Nazi extermination of the Jews, because you acts, obviously the mass murder, the mass executions, and now then you have the next part is, okay, well, let's see if we can find the genocidal intent, and you could probably be able to do that. You could probably do the job there. You would then obviously cite Dennis says, "Oh, but bombs is rather expensive." Well, that's not my fault. You say I will buy it soon. I hope so. I agree. It is very expensive, and it's very. I mean, I think it's ridiculous that academic publishers, put these ridiculous prices on books, which make them unaffordable. I mean, why would you do that? You want as many people to read your books as possible, but when you start hitting them with prices like that, people are just not going to do it. However, it's possible you could get a pirated copy. I know some people have got pirated copies from somewhere. I don't know where, but you could probably find a pirate copy somewhere. It's it's a lot better read than Balkan Tragedy. Anyway, get back to Cynthia's question. So you have obviously the mass executions, and then you would have, as what would you say for your intent? Well, you'd have your intent. You'd have Hitler's Mein Kampf. You would have Hitler's speeches, the various speeches that he had delivered. You would then have the various laws that Hitler had passed, or the Nazis had passed during the 1930s, gradually um, putting more and more restrictions on Jewish life. Then you would have the various plans, initial plans to remove the Jews from Europe. So you'd have all sorts of things like the Madagascar plan and so on. So that was that. And then when those things failed, when the various plans to remove the Jews from Europe failed, you would have the move essentially to end Jewish emigration from Europe, and the decision to move the Jews to the east, and then they would be executed. Now, part of it is, of course, the Wannsee Conference. That will also be a part of the evidence. But if you put the whole thing together, the totality of all of these things, that would be a very substantial case for that there was a genocidal intent. That from the 1933 on, there was a determination on the part of Hitler and the Nazi leaders to remove the Jews one way or another from Europe. But I think that if if Hitler were ever to be put on trial, if one imagined a kind of fictional trial of Hitler, he would, that would be, you'd have present him with those bits of evidence, and I think it would be very difficult for him to defend himself from all of that. But so I'd say that was clearly a case where you have mass executions. But remember, it's also mass executions. It wasn't just like mass killings because of bombing with a complete indifference to civilian life, which is what we have. A total depraved indifference to human life, which is what Israel does, which is a little different, I think, from mass executions. Because mass executions already suggest, not necessarily, but do suggest possibly a genocidal intent. I mean, you really want to kill these people. So I mean, yeah. Then that's why I'd say that clearly would be evidence of genocide. Now, the case of the Turks and the Armenians, you know, that also could qualify as genocide. I mean, what the Turks were doing, it's hard to interpret any of their actions other than to wipe the existence of the Armenian people off the face of the earth. That wasn't done entirely through mass executions, but you could say that was that might qualify as genocidal intent, and you would probably be able to find enough by way of statements from the young Turks who ruled Turkey at the time, that this is what they intended to do, that they intended to wipe the Armenians off the face of the earth. Well, anyway, Cynthia, thank you so much for that really interesting question, and thank you, obviously, Cynthia, for all of your incredible work with the films. And I think my time has run out. Thank you, everybody who had joined me. Thank you so much for all of your really interesting, fascinating questions, comments. I always enjoy that. And we'll be back Thursday. Hope you'll be able to make it. Same time, 3 p.m. Eastern Time. And I really look forward to that. Until then, good night. And see you Thursday. All the best. Bye bye.